Well, thanks everybody for coming out. It's a total pleasure on my part to be able to have a conversation with someone who's a friend, but more importantly, the only member of the Obama administration to have actually threatened decent relations between the United States and Canada. As a result of reports back during the last campaign that were front page news in Canada that he had told consular officials, Canadian consular officials in Chicago during a meeting that certain things that candidate Obama was saying on the campaign trail about NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, were just that mere talk.
That was total crap, you know. That was completely
Page
fabricated.
one news. You don't know how close we were to war with Canada as a result of this guy. But why don't, speaking of that period, or no, it'd be a good deal earlier, let's start off by having you tell everybody, and myself, because I don't know the story, when you met this guy who was a state senator around 2003, 2004, where were you at professionally and in your life, and what was the connection, and was there any common denominator, any logic in your, hooking up with Obama, given whatever your family political past was?
I was down where I am now. I was teaching at Booth, and I didn't know Obama personally, but we had a bunch of common friends. And at the University of Chicago, everyone knew Michelle. I mean, Michelle was quite famous, and so he started running for the Senate. I had a friend who had many years before been the producer of a radio show locally, the Milt Rosenberg Show. And one day, I think it was like 1994, 95, was when I first got to Chicago, he said, I just met a guy, I swear to God, he's going to be the president of the United States. And I said, who is it? Is some governor or something? No, it's a guy named Barack Obama, and he was the editor-in-chief of Harvard Law Review. And I was like, that's a joke. There's no guy named Barack Obama is going to be the president. He fast forward, he runs for Congress. He loses by 40-something points to Bobby Rush. I'm calling my friend. I'm like, isn't that the guy you said was going to be president of the United States? Oh, yeah, he's going to be president. So fast forward to 2003. He decides to run for the Senate. And when people run for the Senate, it's a bit like running for president in that the press is asking about all these national issues. But it's not like running for president that nobody wants to help you. So they call a bunch of people. They call some people at the Kennedy School, and one of my friends says, look, at least call someone from the state of Illinois. We have no idea who this person is that you're telling us. And so they give my name. So they call me, and I said, wait, yeah, I know this guy. That's Michelle's husband, the guy who's the state senator. I said, yeah, okay, fine, I'll help. And I'm thinking, yeah, my friend, that's the guy my friend said is going to be president. So basically, I was the... I don't even know what you call it. I would write little memos, policy memos, analyzing things. And then, Al, if you remember, Alan Keyes gets in the race. The guy Ryan drops out, but nobody in the Republican Party wants to help anybody else get a leg up for the next one, so they bring in Alan Keyes. Alan Keyes is like a crazy bomb thrower. And so my role becomes analyzing all of these quackery things that Alan Keyes has said. Can you analyze that? So it begins, Alan Keyes at a press conference. It wasn't even planned. Somebody asked Alan Keyes, what do you think of reparations for slavery? And Alan Keyes says, Alan Keyes is a political philosophy major. And he said, I have often thought that we should follow the lesson of the ancient Romans and waive all the descendants of slaves from federal taxation for 2 generations. Which he then said, and my opponent wouldn't qualify because he's not the descendant of a slave. So they call me and they say, can you figure out how much that would cost? I said, well, no. I said, no, I can't. Look, I can't even begin to tell you how impossible it would be. They said, well, we need to figure it out. I said, okay, look, at least I can give you a thing you could walk through with a reporter where you got to this number. So I get the current population survey, I project. Finally, I get some number, and I asked them, I said, look, do you want a net present value? Do you want me to just add up 40 years of numbers? And he said, well, whatever's bigger. That's what we want. Okay, so the answer was like 9 trillion. And they were like, oh, that's perfect. So they went out of 9 trillion. But the whole time, I would virtually never see anybody face to face. I'd send these memos from Professor Goolsbee. So for the debate, I don't know if you remember, there was a debate. It was down at the ABC studio that's over by Chicago Theater. And Alan Keyes had proposed replacing the income tax with the sales tax, but waiving all taxes on housing, food, clothing, transportation, senior citizens, and poor people so that it wouldn't be regressive. So I had to figure out what would the rate have to be. And then it turned out the rate would have to be 76%. So at the debate, they brought me down as like the weapon, and I sat there, and Obama said, well, you know, I've asked Professor Goolsbee, and Keyes kept saying to Obama, you're at the University of Chicago, you should walk across the street and talk to someone from the economics department, and they'll tell you you're wrong. And so he said at debate, well, I walked across the street, and I have Professor Goolsbee here tonight, and he said your tax plan is 76%. And Keyes says, I'm like, you know, well, that's not my plan. I'm not for that. That was the whole thing. And I came up after, and we meet face to face. I go up to the green room. I knock on the door. Obama opens the door. He says, who are you? And I said, I'm Professor Goolsbee, because I've been sending him memos. And he just looks, what? I thought I had a guy with a beard and a tweed jacket and a pipe. You don't look anything like a professor. And he said, what is with Goolsbee anyway? And I said, well, Goolsbee, you're telling the whole world you're the skinny guy with the funny name. You stole my bit. I've been saying that 15 years. So that was where we met, though he never again called me Professor Goolsbee for the rest of my life.
If he had known that he was talking to a guy who'd done improvisational comedy at Yale University. So you may get a sense already that he seems to defy the caricature of the University of Chicago as a place where fun goes to die. So he may be the exception that proves the rule here. Okay, so you go from being the surprise skinny guy who's coming up with these figures as a result of these grandiose claims of Alan Keyes to a couple of years later going to Washington as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. Just sort of initial background for some of the obvious questions that I want to ask about what's happened in the last few years and that folks here may want to ask. Just explain what's the Council of Economic Advisors and what was its relationship to all these high-powered figures of a higher profile than certainly you had initially. Former president of Harvard University, Geithner Summers, the new Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner. What is the Council of Economic Advisors?
Okay, the CEA is kind of like the president's internal think tank. It's comprised, there's a chairman, there's 2 members, there are a series of senior economists who are usually either tenured professors on leave or senior government economists on loan, or I forget what the technical term was, seconded or from the government agencies or from the Fed. And essentially their job is to take part in the process. There are 2 or 3 aspects of what it would do. One, the only thing that it's actually on the hook to put out is the economic report of the president. That is not very well read outside of the economics profession, but that's okay. It's still they still work on that. They lead the forecasting, the government forecasting, and they analyze all of the policies as they're coming through the process, some of which just land on your lap, like no one knew anything about the economics of oil spills or Gulf offshore oil drilling, But, when the oil spill happens, they assign the CEA, you go figure out what impact does this have on the economy, what impact does it have on the industry, and stuff like that. There's a guy at Yale who used to be on the Council of Economic Advisors, is an old friend of mine, Bill Nordhaus, and when I took the job, I called Bill and I said, look, what advice do you have? And he said, my advice is that a good Council of Economic Advisors, like a good gardener, 90% of the job is pulling weeds and 10% is planting seeds. And so it is kind of my dad used to always say, fault finder is a minimum wage job, but in the government, that's not necessarily true. Fault finding of really bad ideas is extremely valuable, actually, and that's a lot of what the CEA does. But it's think tank for the president.
Okay, let me take that sort of metaphor and now mangle it. When Obama picked his economic team, to a lot of folks, it appeared to be stacked with Bill Clinton alums. Some would say Bill Clinton retreads, and that you were sort of in a distinct minority of inherent, first and foremost, Obama folks, Obama loyalists who were in there. In fact, in one of the many books that's been written about the last few years in the economy by a very good Time magazine reporter called The New Deal, there is an unnamed campaign staffer who's quoted as saying, after Austan was picked to be a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, quote, when Austan got hosed, a lot of us were like, hey, what's happening to change we believe in? Now, as I make you uncomfortable with that question, was there a sense that, wait a second, why do you need all these old Clinton folks?
I was, to fast forward from the Alan Keyes episode to 2008, around the end of 2006, Obama was thinking about running for president. They called me up and said, look, the campaign's going to be in Chicago. Is this something you'd want to spend some time doing? Of course, at that time, I was like, my research is very important. I don't know if I have time to work on this. I kind of got in, and so there was a cadre of campaign people, policy side, but also political people, who were there all along. There was definitely tension, obviously, between us and the Clinton camp, because for a year and a half, we were running against each other. Much of that had lessened a great deal after the primary was over. Now, it is true, it's this kind of the Washington way. Everybody's trying to get in because they're perceiving, hey, this guy's going to be the president. So at one point, there's an old Clinton guy, Bruce Reed, who I knew some, and I asked Bruce Reed after the primary.
Co-author of a book with
our mayor, yeah, that's true,
Emanuel.
Called The Plan. I have forgotten that, that's true. So I asked Bruce, I said, you were there in 1992 with Bill Clinton. How does this work? This seems real weird. We had a lot of joy, really, in the Obama campaign. People really, it felt like we're working at NASA in 1969 or something. We're putting a man on the moon, even if you're sweeping the floor. I'm helping put a man on the moon. I said, does it get better? What is it? He said, okay, first thing is you should celebrate what your guy came out of nowhere. You're never going to do anything that's as fun as that. That's amazing. The general's going to be way less fun than the primary. All these people are going to now show up. They're going to say, hey, thanks for, winning the nomination, whatever. We can take it from here. He goes, then, if he wins, the transition is going to be way less fun than the general. Because then all these people are going to come in. He should be bipartisan. He should hire me. He should what? And then when you get there, that's going to be way less fun than the transition. So he said, pretty much just get nostalgic for what has just happened. And, I kind of think he was right. It was, it felt a little like that. But credit, I think, is due to the president. It was totally obvious by the time of the election to the economists, even if it was not yet well understood by the public, that this wasn't going to be an economic crisis that was just concentrated in Wall Street. If you remember in the fall of 2008, the stock market was way down. We'd had the TARP, we'd had all the scare, but it hadn't yet showed up in the economic data. And so there were a bunch of people saying publicly, well, maybe this is going to be a crisis that's just concentrated in Wall Street and they deserve it and who cares. But the only reason they said that is because the data doesn't come out but with a multi-month lag. So all the economists knew it was we're going off the cliff. And the president, I think's first response was to look at the history. Virtually every new president that comes in stumbles and bumbles, and the first 6 to 9 months is really getting your feet. And there was no 6 to 9 months that anybody could afford to do that. They had to bring in people who were going to know what they were doing from the first second. And I kind of think that's why the uncharitable way to say it is, oh, well, these people are retreads. The charitable way to say it is, these are people who've had, in many cases, had the same jobs before. And so the second they got there, I mean, they passed the stimulus in the first couple of weeks. They do the stress tests, you know, right at the beginning, confront the auto thing. I mean, it was like one string of catastrophic situations after another.
And, I mean, in a couple of these books, and I do suggest you take a look at them. There's one book, for instance, The New New Deal, in ways I had no appreciation of. If you remember that period, November, December, right after Obama was elected, and he sets up headquarters here, I don't know where, down the Hilton or something, but the behind-the-scenes drama.
The GSA building.
Particularly the GSA building, when it came to the state of the economy, and you had all these high-powered guys consulting him and going, oh boy, this is going to be a problem. And the aforementioned Summers, there's some quote in one of these books about, you know, at least, you know, Roosevelt had the benefit of inheriting this, you know, Hoover-related mess, and we're not going to have the political benefit of that. It's all going to play out on our watch. But let's start hopscotching around to some of these things. You just mentioned the stimulus. To this day, it strikes me, Austan, that there's a huge amount of ignorance, Democrats, Republicans, independents, journalists, about what was in that package. Yesterday I was reminded, Peggy Noonan column in the Wall Street Journal, usually fairly perceptive person. I may not agree with her politics all the time, but just this, to me, gratuitous bashing of what she labeled pork barrel spending stimulus package. There was a whole lot more in there than folks even today realize, and that it would seem to me counters the notion that this should be some pejorative, which folks just mentioned on the campaign trail, oh, the stimulus. Remind us of what was in there.
Well, there were a lot of things in there. The way it's put together was a bit the Washington way, which is, you know, 10% of your thing and 10% of yours and 10% of here. And in the politics of the Reinvestment Act, everyone knew that it was going to be a close vote because already by the end of January, McConnell and the Republicans, particularly in the Senate, had essentially announced we're going to be against everything and every person that you nominate. They'd already held up our nominations at the beginning for no reason other than just they were trying to throw sand in the gears. So everybody knew it's going to come down to a very small number of votes. And there were sort of 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats who were the marginal votes. All of them were pressing for smaller amount on the spending and more on the tax cuts and make the total size smaller than the initial estimate. So it ends up being 35, 40% tax cuts because Republicans wanted more on the tax cut side, even though they end up not voting for it. And that was the part of it that I most thought about and was most involved in. If you go to the spending side, the answer is it's some of everything. I mean, there was a big argument taking place in the administration at that moment. How long is this downturn going to last? And there was one group of people that said it's going to be a V-shaped recovery. Every time you have a big downturn, you have a big upturn. So, you know, we're going to come cruising back 1 to 2 years later. The other camp said, no, look, we had a big financial crisis. We had a bubble pop. That's usually 5, 7 years it takes to come back from such a thing. So we're back and forth. And as I say, the Washington way, the kind of thing Washington's not good at, is here are 3 worldviews. We have to pick which one is right and do only the things that comport with that worldview, and we have to forget the other 2. It doesn't work that way. So if you go look at the stimulus, there's some of let's call it Larry Summers, Christy Romer, were more of the view.
Christy Romer
was the
sort of
chair
labor
of the
historian from where? Stanford?
She was from Berkeley.
From Berkeley, who was nominally your boss. She was the chairperson of the...
So they were more of the view, the average downturn lasts 11 months. So you don't want to pass a 5-year, so one side said, let's make 5-year infrastructure investments. Any big single thing that you could conceive of could not be done within a 2 to 3 year time frame, or else was completely not of the order of magnitude of the downturn. Okay, so therein is our trouble right from the start. Either it's going to be a very clear narrative, we're building a smart grid for America, in which case it's going to take 10 years and it's not going to be big enough to confront a $2 trillion hole in the GDP, or it's going to be a collection of a whole bunch of stuff, and we're constantly going to be trying to explain, well, what is it and what does it do? And the much discussed by Governor Romney prediction that the unemployment rate would not exceed 8% was made by Christy Romer in the transition. Okay, so it was before we ever got there. That was when and it wasn't just Christy Romer. All the private forecasters were saying that unemployment would rise significantly, but nothing like what it ended up rising to. So if you go back and look at this initial forecast where she said this, and it's the same thing when Mitt Romney says the president promised the unemployment rate would be 5.5% today. That was made in the transition by Christie. Actually, by the mid to late 2009, the official government forecast that you can go look up in the budget is that the unemployment rate in the fall of 2012 would be 8.2%. So already by 6 months in, we totally well understood what the circumstance was that we're facing. Their view was if you do a bunch of long-lived things, the recession will be over by then. And that's been the problem of stimulus in the past. It'll just be inflationary. Then all the stuff's going to come on. So there were a bunch of things in stimulus like first home buyer tax credit, cash for clunkers, different stuff that was geared toward get it from 2010 into 2009. Because 2010 will be fine. 2009 is the epically worst year, since the Depression. And then there's other stuff that I think is, call it more visionary. The infrastructure stuff was quite good. There's a lot of energy things that I think that book is pretty compelling. I'm not an energy economics expert, but it was pretty compelling that made a big impact. And then there was a lot of money going to the states to try to prevent them from laying off the teachers and still provide health care. In the end, look, public opinion has decided that it didn't work. Expert opinion says there were a couple million more jobs for 2 to 3 years than would have been without it. And at one point, I asked David Axelrod, why do we not defend this more? We can go out and show this. Even the 8% prediction, nobody observes that it said if you did nothing, the unemployment rate would peak out at 8.9%, and it was already above that before the first dollar of stimulus ever even went out the door. So it's kind of weird to say that it didn't work. And David said, look, the thing is, you think we could prove, we could establish this thing? And I said, yeah, I think we could. And he said, well, the thing is, our choice is we have to establish only one thing. We don't have the ability to convince everyone of educate everyone on everything. And people like the president. People are open to his ideas. People really don't want to go revisit an argument about whether the thing that happened 3.5 years ago worked or didn't work at that time. So I kind of think that's why nobody talks about it.
Did you if you think back at the time, did you overestimate the beneficial impact of that $800 billion?
Yes and no. Like I say, the part I worked on was the tax part. I think we overestimated the benefit of the tax cuts. Now, partly that was just a political necessity. You had to get these 5 marginal votes, and they all wanted more tax cuts and less on the spending. I think the evidence is starting to show. It's going to take us a while before we have all the evidence as academics to evaluate it, but I think it's likely to show that people did not spend the tax cuts because we're coming out of this big financial crisis. People were using the money to try to get their debt down and try to deleverage. So the impact on economic growth of those tax cuts was probably smaller than tax cuts would be in a normal period. I think that's fair.
Here's another angle on the way the tax cuts played out, and it gets to the notion of whether the administration should have been criticized for the way they marketed or didn't market, publicized or didn't publicize what was going on. And this is one of the books, the same book by this fellow Grunwald, that concedes, and this book is generally very sympathetic to what Obama and Austin folks did, but it concedes that, quote, some of Obama's substance-first policies now seem politically daft. The most damaging was his decision to dribble out what was called the making work pay tax cuts through reduced federal withholding instead of sending out fat rebate checks that would let people know he had actually cut their taxes. In the end, most Americans would get an extra $16 per week slipped into their paychecks, but polls would find that fewer than 10% of them were aware of the largest middle-class tax cut in a generation. Incredibly, that was the point. Studies in behavioral economics have shown that we're more likely to save money when it arrives in a big chunk. When we receive the same windfall without noticing it, we're more likely to spend it without thinking. So Summers and the rest of the economic team argued for leaking out the tax cuts without fanfare to mainline more cash into the economic bloodstream. Or, as our beloved mayor later described the strategy to this author, quote, the geniuses on the economic team wanted the money dripped out so nobody friggin' saw it. End of quote. So,
look, the thing is, I appreciate,
as a genius on the economic team.
Look, the thing was, I appreciate that he said that about the studies. The Bush tax cuts had been sent out as a check, and the research was overwhelmingly clear that it didn't do anything, that people had not spent that money. And so you had 35% of an $800 billion thing whose purpose is to try to avoid us going into a depression. Our view was we don't have any choice. We could go do that thing and we could mail out checks. This was well understood at the time. It wasn't like, oh, we came back, oh, how dumb are we? It was well understood. We could mail out a check. People will say, woohoo, I got a check. But we know with 100% certainty that will not help the economy. So we can't do that. And so it was actually a Republican, Marty Feldstein's idea to change the withholding. So that's the way we did it. Now, it was totally painful to observe as we go into the 2010 midterm election. They're asking people, what do they think about taxes? And like 60% of America thinks their taxes went up in the stimulus. It was like, no, that was the biggest middle-class tax cut possibly ever. No, nobody's taxes went up, and 98% of people got a huge tax cut. But again and again, I don't know that there was. I don't know what the alternative. It was well understood when we had the first transition meeting in December here in Chicago, where they've just named who are going to be all of the leading officials, and we go down there and it's pouring snow. They all fly in. Paul Volcker stomping his way through 10 inches of snow because you can't, all the cabs are shut down, so he's taking the L down to walk over there. We go through the meeting. One thing after another is horrible. I'm talking about housing. I'm like, look, house prices are down 25%. People expect them to go down another 15%. We're going to have maybe $1 trillion of people underwater. The GDP's going down the tubes. We're going to have the biggest stimulus of all times. And Axelrod looks at the paper where Christie has this 8% thing, and he says, and he holds up the graph, which is now legendary graph for being too optimistic, and he says, you mean to tell me that we're going to pass the biggest stimulus of all time? Am I getting your thing out of order? I apologize. If I took your question. That was just my sneaky way to look at his question. See, I was he goes, you're telling me we're going to pass the biggest stimulus of all times, and the unemployment rate is still going to go to 8%? And we were like, yes. And if we don't, it's going to go 2 points higher than that. Okay, now move the base of that and move everything up a couple of points. And as I say, it was well understood. We're going to do a thing that's going to be a humongous heavy lift, and people are still going to be in a really bad mood because the economy is not going to look good at all. And I think it's to the, look, I understand fully why that's hurt the president when it comes to the voting booth, and that it may not mean anything for this election that we avoided a depression. But I'm telling you, historians are going to look back and say, wow, they did not have a depression when net worth of households fell by 25% in a 3-month period, about double the size of the 1929 financial shock that sent us into the Great Depression last time. I had colleagues from around the country calling up saying, you guys keep announcing what you're going to do to prevent the depression. You're not going to prevent it. What you should be announcing is what's your plan B. When the depression has started, how will you get us out of it? And so the thing is, look, I'm proud that through combination, I'm not meaning to imply that it's just the administration at all. The Fed played a huge role, and several of the actions taken at the end of the Bush administration played a big role. But that collection of things not going into depression was extremely important, and the stimulus was part of that, and it did help, though nobody really thinks that's true. So, you know, what are you going to do?
You mentioned Volcker taking the L in, but there's a scene in this one book of a key session as a bunch of these guys, Geithner, Summers, taking the blue line out to O'Hare. I don't know, couldn't find a cab or something, but notion, I can't imagine Summers ever taken the L before in his life. I had this image of the future of the sort of the Western economy, being figured out.
Everybody's like,
as people are going, doors on the left for Montrose.
Totally. That's totally what it. That's totally what it was.
Irving Park on the right.
But I mean, this was a grim meeting. That's the same meeting, and when the meeting ends, I mean, it was one thing after another. And Geithner says, "Look, I'm here to tell you about financial markets. They've collapsed. Half the major banks in the country may be insolvent. We don't know. We basically used up all the first half of the TARP, and we might need another $700 billion, and it's not at all clear that Congress will give any money." So it comes to the end, and I go up to Obama and I say, that's the worst meeting for the incoming president that they've had since 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, maybe since 1861, Abraham Lincoln. Hey, that's the welcome to the presidency. The country is, just split in half. And that's when Obama says, Goolsbee, this is not even my worst briefing this week. And I was like, oh my God. And so whatever it is, at the height of the thing, and there was some very much of the first 3 months in office is kind of a blur, and it's like dinner of Tic Tacs and M&Ms and sleeping under the desk kind of thing. And as you know, some of the popular characterizations of the president are not true, but the thing that he's even keel and a cool guy is totally true, and thank God he was. I mean, the economists have a sort of a professional disposition to pontificating, you're telling David Axelrod, what you should do, run ads that say, whatever. Economists tend to have very high opinion of their own ideas. And all of the economists and all the economic team, everybody's got an idea. We should do A, B, and C. At the end of the day, they were all, thank God he's the guy who has to make these decisions and not us, because there were a bunch of them that were pretty creepy.
Let me ask sort of a final little question about the economists and to the extent there was groupthink, and this is, we'll get into a little section here, I don't know, let's call it the auto industry. Can you tell me about what you guys actually were thinking about the Cash for Clunkers program? Remember that one, folks? I mean, did any of you guys seriously think that that would do much and not simply just, I don't know, accelerate purchases as opposed to actually increasing the level of demand for cars? What were you thinking?
No, I mean, they were thinking they wanted to accelerate the purchase of cars. I mean, it's not in Germany they had...
what I mean is, you know, okay, I'm going to get a new car, you know, in the fall. Well, I'll just get it now into this program as opposed to accelerating overall.
So the 6 months from the end of 2008, beginning of 2009, is the worst 6 months of GDP growth in the 65 years of GDP data that we have. So my view was, you don't have to be a full-bore Keynesian who believe, you know, there's one group of Keynesian economists who essentially believe stimulus is free. It's almost like the Laffer curve version of stimulus, that you could increase the growth rate enough that it would pay for itself. You don't have to believe that to ask, in the worst 6 months of all times, do you want to pull from the future to make the present less bad? Yes, I think the answer is you want to pull from the future to make the present less bad. And that was the intention of Cash for Clunkers. And it had the double benefit that the environmental and fuel consumption negative impact is greatest by far from these really old cars. So if you could get really old cars off the road, at the same time you were inducing people to move their car purchases forward into 2009, that was the reason they did it. Other countries like Germany had done a similar policy. In Germany, it was much bigger. It applied to many more cars, and that was the primary way that they aided their auto industry, is they came out with a massive scrappage program that essentially subsidized to get a bunch of people to buy a new car. Measured by that, Cash for Clunkers was a success. I think the thing that makes you look back at Cash for Clunkers and say, you could have used the money more on the infrastructure, is that's designed for a V-shaped recovery. And it ends up, we didn't have a V-shape. We had a financial crisis kind of recovery. And so anything that was short-term oriented, it'd be better to put the focus on the long-term oriented stuff. But as I say, nobody knew that at the time. You had a lot of prominent people saying, no, you should just do whatever you can. Stimulus should be about get it out of 11 and 10 into 09 so that you kind of smooth things out. That's what you should be doing, because by 2011, you know, everything's going to be great.
Okay, this amazing period of astonishing problems then includes Detroit. It's been reported that you advised the president not to bail out Chrysler, since you apparently thought it was unsalvageable and might reduce chances of saving General Motors. It's now thriving, paid back its loans. Should we be glad the president did not take your advice?
Well, I don't like to get into, you know, private meetings with the president where there were differences of opinion, of which that happened many times. I don't like rehashing, going through. I think sometimes when you read these books and you see that people, you know, they're clearly trying to carry out a grudge of one guy versus the other guy. I don't think that's very becoming. I think, as I said before, and the data back me up, history has not been kind to administrations where everyone agreed with each other and all they could say is, hey, good idea, boss. And the Obama administration was nothing like that. Now, on the autos, there were multiple camps. One group of people said or thought, you know, too bad for you. Things are tough all around. Detroit got themselves into this mess by making the cars that they made. They've lost market share for many decades. They're bloated. Their cost structure can't be sustained. And actually, the polling backed up that group. The fact that now the auto industry bailout is a great credit to the president, and you have his opponent saying, oh, yeah, I would have done the same thing. That was an easy call. That could not be more false. They had polling from that moment, and they asked people, and 70+% of people said they did not favor an auto rescue, a bailout, even with the qualifier, even if it cost 1 million jobs. 70-something% of people said, no, we don't have the money. Let's not try to do it. So one camp said, politically, this is toxic. We can't do a bailout. A second group said, if you try to save Chrysler, the market, the overall market is really depressed. If you try to save Chrysler, it's a huge economy of scale business and Chrysler's small. You could really endanger GM and Ford by trying to keep Chrysler alive. And a third group said, look, we've saved, we, the United States government, have saved banks, saved insurance companies, saved Fannie and Freddie, saved a bunch of financial types. How can we not do this? I mean, and it was the president list, and to hear the discussion now, there wasn't any money that was available. The argument that like, hey, they could just go into bankruptcy and raise financing and finance themselves out of bankruptcy is completely bogus. Anybody that says that, name one lender in the entire world who at the time expressed that they would lend money at all under any circumstances. That was a complete non-starter. The question was, if we do not give money to Fiat to buy Chrysler, they will commence liquidation starting next week. That was, everyone understood that. And the president said, look, I understand it's risky, but we got to take this bet on that you guys, and he would say to the auto team, you guys have to go figure out a way to get the cost down and impose whatever the toughest conditions that have to be imposed to make them competitive. But this has to work. The economy cannot afford to go lose right now. We're February, March of 2009. We cannot afford to lose 1 million jobs right now. The spillover on the rest of the manufacturing industry, we don't even know what it would be. And so, look, I'm thrilled that Chrysler repaid their money, that they were able to get private financing to replace the government loans, and the government got its money back. And I think this is one of those, like the Osama bin Laden decision, which was actually extremely controversial at the time. There were a lot of high-level advisors advising the president in both of these cases, don't make this decision, it's too risky. And the president went out on a limb and said, no, I'm going to make the decision. He deserves the credit for that because he's the one who would have taken the blame if it hadn't worked.
Right. We're going to have time for a few questions near the end, so in about 5 minutes, if a few of you, won't be time for a lot of questions. There are a couple of microphones here, and I just ask as you prepare to make the questions as concise.
What's good about this, the microphones are here in the front, and so we can see you. One time there's an auditorium in the White House, and it's steep, and they got the lights on so you can't see. So I would usually say, look, if you have the microphone, just start speaking, and you have the floor. And I didn't realize there were two. And there's always one of these guys, the guy right in the front. He stands up, raises his hand. I said, just start speaking. And before he begins to speak, somebody in the other microphone begins making the most offensive cultural critique of people are lazy and this and blah, blah, blah. And this guy's back us to the audience, so everybody thinks it's him speaking. And finally, he just turns and he throws him. He's like, it's not me. So, but you're going to be on the hook. We can see you right here.
That reminds me of a line. I was editor of the tempo section at the Tribune, and some agent was hawking me an unauthorized biography or autobiography of Bob Hope, and it claimed he was on a USO trip, and his wife was suspicious, flew into wherever they were, Vietnam, walked in the hotel room at 2 in the morning and saw him in bed with somebody else. She turns on the lights, and he sees her and goes, "It's not me!" Maybe it was Bob Hope at the White House. Housing. Housing helped to blow up the economy. For the last few years, it has held back the recovery. Critics all over the political spectrum have complained that the administration hasn't done enough to turn things around. You were very much involved in housing policy. Tell us about that, and if it's fair to ask, why didn't you guys do more?
Okay, I think three things about housing. The first is...
Not that he's thought of this. Okay.
For 70 years, the real price of housing, so housing price growth minus inflation, it's grown about 0.5% to 1% a year. Pretty steady for 70 years. We then go through an 8-year period where the real price of housing grows about 15% a year. It then collapses. As the prices go up like this, we got way overbuilt. We still have 5 million vacant homes in this country. Obviously, there's not going to be a whole lot of construction when there's 5 million vacant homes that people could move into. And normally, construction and all housing-related stuff is about 1/3 of a normal expansion. So one obvious explanator of why the recovery isn't growing faster is that we can't go back to what we were doing right before the recession began. All the V-shaped recoveries in the past, 1982, 1975, they come booming back because the interest rate goes way up, construction goes down, investment goes down, all this stuff happens. Then when the interest rate comes down, woo, everybody just goes right back to doing what they were doing before. We had a bubble, we got 5 million vacant homes, that's not gonna work. And just to alert people in their head, in most markets, or at least in many markets, a lot of people feel we've turned the corner. So it's not continuing to go down. But now the question is, what's going to happen? And I believe that we're going to go back to growing 0.5% to 1% a year. If you're thinking that we're going to go back to the go-go days, I think you're wrong. You're living the Onion headline. There was a joke Onion headline, but it was a joke. It says, "Angry nation demands new bubble to invest in to restore prosperity." That's not going to work. That was a joke. Okay, so that's first. Second, it was well understood when we were there at the beginning of 2009, look, we have to do something on housing. That could mean a bunch of things. Are we just trying to prevent foreclosure? Are we trying to address the wealth effect that people's prices have gone down? Are we trying to make sure that people can buy new houses now because the mortgage market's collapsing? The best thing you could do, looked at just from the housing perspective, would be to go write down mortgages for all these people that are underwater. The only problem is there's $750 billion of negative equity in the system. So we could figure out no way, somebody has to eat $750 billion to do that. You couldn't put $750 billion of losses onto the banks. They were already borderline insolvent. The government didn't have $750 billion, and the homeowners themselves don't have to. So there's no easy answer to that. What would we have done? I mean, and I still don't think, there's a little less now because prices are back up some, but that's still basically the thing that's overhanging a whole bunch of stuff, and it's not obvious what you do. And then the last thing that I'd say about housing is the following is extremely unusual. If you look at the price of rental and the price of sale of houses, those usually move together because they tend to be a lot of the same housing stock. They've now diverged quite substantially for almost 2 years. House prices have fallen, and in most major urban areas, rental prices are up significantly. So the market could not be saying in a clearer way, not having nothing to do with the government, the way we're going to get rid of 5 million vacant homes is we're going to convert them to rentals, and some of the 25-year-olds are going to move out of their parents' basement and they're going to rent those houses. And when they do, they're going to buy some crappy pots and pans and stuff that in the past, as any indicator, is a big driver of an expansion. Where the population's up 10 million since the recession began, household formation's been close to nothing. Why is that not happening? Well, it turns out the answer is because something like the majority of those vacant homes are owned by Fannie and Freddie. And Fannie and Freddie's regulator says he doesn't want to be a landlord, and he's just going to wait until prices come back and sell the houses. So it's driving you, and because it's set up as a conservatorship, not a receivership, or maybe the reverse. I know there's a lot of lawyers here, but it's one of those. We're not actually allowed to tell them what to do. We're on the hook for the bill, but the government is not allowed to say, go do it. Like, what are you doing? Go convert your stuff into rentals or sell it to people who will rent it out. I think it's a big problem, and I don't, the president nominated somebody to take his place, and the Republicans in the Senate asked that person, what are you going to do about principal reduction? And he said, I'm open to look at all sorts of things. And so they put a hold on him, and they said, we'll never confirm anyone to that job who says they will contemplate principal write-downs. So I don't see how you get out of that.
Well, thank you. Given my crappy personal investment history, I'm glad you've warned me off throwing some money into a new chain called Crappy Pots and Pans. We have time for a couple real short. Miss.
You didn't really say anything about the Federal Reserve. Everything that I have read, the cause of the downturn in the economy and things that happened prior to the Obama administration was caused by the Federal Reserve. So recently, Bernanke in Aspen said he was going to print more money, and so who now controls the economy, the President and Congress or the Federal Reserve?
Okay, there's a lot of important issues in this question. Let me start by saying I don't believe that the Federal Reserve is the primary cause of the economic crisis. Wow, I've never been in an audience where the Fed got a round of applause. Here's the thing. The only way you could say that is that the Fed does have regulatory oversight. I mean, they had through the 90s loose monetary policy, which may have helped fuel the bubble. But I think it was the deregulation of the financial sector which really contributed to that thing morphing into something that could take down the world. The Fed does have regulatory oversight over many big banks. And so you could fault the Fed for saying they should have had a tighter eye on them. But the one thing to be aware of is much of the worst of the shenanigans were propagated by non-banks. And those non-banks are not under the Fed's oversight. They weren't under anybody's oversight for the most part. And that was one of the big things in Dodd-Frank. For whatever criticism of Dodd-Frank, one of the most fundamental things it does is say anybody that's systemically significant is now regulated by the Fed, and the Fed is allowed to tell them you don't have enough capital, you have to stop what you're doing. So I actually think that was important. Now the Fed is the equivalent of printing money. And is a group of investors and gold bugs and Ron Paul who have got kind of in their head what the economists call a quantity theory of money. And they're saying the monetary base is expanding, and so that's going to become a hyperinflation. They know, look, the monetary base is up 200%, so inflation's about to be up 200%. They've been saying that for the last 3 years. Inflation's about to be 200%. Okay, the thing is, those people do not remember the formula for the quantity theory of money, because it says the monetary base times the velocity of money is what leads to inflation. And as much as the monetary base is up, the velocity of money is down more than the monetary base is up. There's absolutely no indicator that in the medium term there's anything like inflation. We've teetered on the edge of deflation multiple times. And so I think Bernanke deserves a lot of credit for helping have prevented that. And Bernanke and I knew each other. He was a professor at Princeton. The people in the NBER that are in his group, the monetary economics group, when he was named head of the Fed, those people, as I said, they would wake up each morning and look in the mirror, and they'd say, why not me? Why Ben Bernanke and not me? I'm in the monetary economics group at the NBER. And then sometime starting in 2008, they'd all get up and say, whew, not me. And they'd be like, that jerk is screwing it up. So that's what I think about the Fed.
We don't have a whole lot of time. If you guys...
He waited a long time.
If you guys keep it real short, we'll get to it.
Okay, that was his polite way to say, I have to keep it real short. Fine. You ask the question. I'll be short.
My question is about the students that are coming out of the system now, and they, similar, my son had some Stafford loans.
Yes.
And they're 8.7%, 7.8%. And I was wondering what... you know, like President Obama says he wants to help the middle class. Well, the middle class, their children are being burdened with no jobs and things like that.
Look, I think it's a borderline catastrophic problem for a lot of people. It's not, you know, very widespread because you got the double whammy that these rates were set at a time when rates were normal. You know, 5%, 8%. That was a normal interest rate. Yeah, well, not when there's no inflation and the average rate is, you know, 10 basis points. And in a normal time, you'd think, okay, well, look, you could go replace a student loan with some other. You could pay off the student loan and get some other loan. But we're in the middle, still continuing massive credit crunch, and employment prospects are really difficult in the short run, so it's really hard to get a loan. I thought the best thing, so the short answer is not a lot of great prospects in the short run to resolve that problem. Republicans have pushed back significantly on most types of financial aid, and if you look at, say, the Ryan budget, I mean, it makes this problem significantly tighter. But I thought there was a glimmer of hope when we got to this thing that there was going to be the reset of all of these student loans, so they had agreed to this grace period, or whatever you want to call it, at low rates, and so it was going to hop back up. There was bipartisan consensus, and they almost immediately, both the Republican and the Democratic candidate for president and everybody in Congress said, well, let's make this problem go away, and they just kind of extended it. I took from the fact that they both did that, and everybody just kind of said, no fuss, no muss, let's not make a big thing about it, let's just do it, that maybe when push comes to shove, that's sufficiently unpopular that they might address it. I wish I had some better news, but that's the best I got.
Should President Obama win on Tuesday, what 1, 2, 3 quick prescriptions do you have for him for policy initiatives?
Well, I'm quite nervous about the fiscal cliff. Whether you think the stimulus worked or didn't work, biggest year of the stimulus was plus $275 billion in 1 year. 2013, with all the tax increases and the sequester, that's a minus $700 billion in 2013. So this is a really large number. Most business people I talk to have not factored. Okay, not the background. I'm taking, you're bossing me around now, he's bossing me around, everybody's bossing me around. Okay, I think address the fiscal cliff, you have to. What did he say? Okay, you'd have to address the fiscal cliff. You have to do that in weeks. I don't know if they'll be able to, because I think the same dynamic that led to the blow up over the debt ceiling last time may very well lead to a blow up again. As you go into 2013, I think the overwhelming pressures are going to be about grand bargain tax reform and confronting the deficit. For better, for worse. I think that's what's going to be on the agenda. And so I kind of think that's by far number one. Then if you get through that, and I'm somewhat optimistic actually, they almost had a deal last year. I think they could maybe do a deal. Then I think, you know, I know the president cares a lot about energy. They might go that way, maybe immigration reform. I wish you'd do something on education, but somewhere in those three I think would probably be the prescription I'd have.
Sir. You mentioned the non-bank lenders that are out there. In Chicago, you go back to 2004, predatory lending was just blowing the city apart. It took Chicago and everybody else 4 years to even figure that out. I was wondering whether there's in process a way to have a CAT scan of the quality of life of places that would come out every month to saying, yes, this stuff is really bubbling up. We're really getting these foreclosures are rolling through, so you don't have a 2 or 3 year lag and maybe a monthly kind of index, sort of along the line of the indicators that the MetroPulse people out of CMAP have started to generate, perhaps.
It's an interesting idea that does exist at the state level for, as you might imagine, industry participants, investors and stuff like that. There's a company whose name is, I think, Realty Track, who goes down and checks the notes on all the thing and say, how are the foreclosures and how's it happening? And they break it down by state level, and it's pretty up-to-date data. They were willing to share their data with the government, so the government does get that data. At the city level or the neighborhood level, frankly, I think you get into some of these privacy kind of issues that make people a little nervous when they find out, well, wait a minute, you know, you're averaging the mortgages of all the mortgages on our street, and you know how many people are foreclosing on our street that they'd have to confront. But I think the tracking of that information is quite important, and I think that we're of two minds what should happen with foreclosures. Okay, so one group says, let's just plow through them, foreclose on everybody, and sell the stuff back out into the market. Let's just get it over with. And the other side says, let's make it as slow as possible because maybe the economy will come back and the people can start making their payments and they won't have to be thrown out of their houses. And that's kind of a religious war between those two groups.
I was just thinking if this had started in 2005, if the Fed had watched this, they could have tamped down some of the excesses. I'm just
Look,
trying to
could
think
have, but there is the Dodd-Frank creates this Financial Stability Oversight Council, the so-called FSOC. And the FSOC is supposed to survey the landscape of the financial world and identify what are the big systemic risks before they blow up. So in theory, circa 2005, the FSOC would be able to say, wow, what the heck is going on over here? Look at how much additional lending is happening. Look at the loan-to-value ratios. The median loan-to-value ratio for several of the years in the 2000s was 100%. The median. So that is a mess. I mean, you know that is a mess. And if they were keeping track of that kind of thing,
the word would be exuberance in another era.
Yeah. Yeah.
Before we go, just two final things for me, Austan. One policy thing, one decidedly personal. First one, I think, potentially touches the lives of everybody here, and certainly their kids and grandkids, and it's, among other things, it's entitlement reform. Many commentators, a lot of economists, believe that the Simpson-Bowles Commission provided a very reasonable framework for Congress and the administration to start addressing our huge deficit and debt problems. Obama appointed the commission and then never really supported their recommendations, nor really even asked Congress to use their recommendations as a serious starting point for discussions. Why is that? And can you generalize about the group of economists and what were working there, and without naming names, what their general feeling was towards Simpson-Bowles?
Okay, first let me disagree slightly with the premise on Bowles-Simpson. Bowles-Simpson was a commission. I think you're right. If you sit down and look at it, it's a perfectly reasonable starting point, at least, to debate what are these issues. The fundamental insight of Bowles-Simpson, in my view, was their call for what they called balanced deficit reduction. So they said, we got to cut the deficit by $4 trillion over the next 10 years to stabilize and start shrinking the debt to GDP ratio, which is the thing that matters. And so let's do that. They say 3-to-1 cuts to new revenues, though that's only because the budget doesn't know how to do a net present value in Washington. So it's really $2 trillion of cuts, $1 trillion of revenue, and $1 trillion of saved interest. Fine. Call it whatever you want. That's how they do it. It's $1 trillion on entitlements, $1 trillion on discretionary, $1 trillion of interest, $1 trillion of revenue. They then also have a very specific plan of where do you get each of those trillion, but the basic idea of Bowles-Simpson is that. Bowles and Simpson's proposal could not get the support of the fiscal commission itself. They needed a supermajority to pass it, and they couldn't get it because there was unanimous opposition by all the Republicans from the House on the commission. since all budgets must originate in the House, it was totally obvious to everyone the second that it came out at Bowles-Simpson, if every Republican from the House is killing this thing, it's going nowhere. So the president had made a very public declaration that he would not raise taxes on the middle class, and Bowles-Simpson does. So it was inconceivable that the president would just come out and say, well, you guys are all opposed to Bowles-Simpson, but I'm going to declare that I'm for raising taxes on the middle class as a thing. They would have immediately turned and said, see, we told you he was lying, and he's lying, and here this is all just a cover for him to raise your taxes. However, fast forward to the debt ceiling negotiation. What Obama offered to the Republicans was more favorable to them than Bowles-Simpson, involved less revenue and more spending cuts than Bowles-Simpson did. And it was totally premised on Bowles-Simpson of let's get to $4 trillion, let's do it with 2.5 times the spending cuts to revenue. And so, look, in my world, that's Bowles-Simpson. That's exactly what the Bowles-Simpson framework is do it in a balanced way. And the thing that blew me away is if the opposition wasn't just, I thought what it would be is Obama says 2/3, 1/3, and the other side says 100-0, and they have a fight and they'll end up, whatever, 80-20. No, what the opposition is, he says 2/3, 1/3, they say 135% cuts and negative 35% revenue. And they said, not joking, they didn't say this as a joke. We come to negotiations, they say, look, we're prepared to compromise. The Ryan budget is 135% spending cuts, and yours is 66%. We are prepared to compromise on 100% spending cuts. And I thought it was a joke, but it wasn't. That was their position. We're willing to compromise on our original position. And look, I think if this election is about any policy thing, it is about if you need $4 trillion in a grand bargain in 2013, do you want to do it $3 trillion of cuts and $1 trillion of revenue, or do you want to do it $6 trillion of cuts and negative $2 trillion of revenue? You could do it either way, but I'm telling you, if you go cut $6 trillion, that is some serious, serious cutting. You can forget the entire education, the discretionary spending, not to mention the squeezing and crushing of Social Security and Medicare. In the Ryan budget, okay, discretionary non-defense spending right now is about 10% of GDP. That's the lowest it's been since Eisenhower. In the Ryan budget, that goes to 2% of GDP. It has to, because you got to cut everything, and that's perfectly coherent. But it's just everybody should understand it's a coherent philosophy, but it is a major radical upending of what you think the government's doing. There's not going to be financial aid. There's not going to be NIH money and funding for innovation. There's not going to be any of that stuff because you can't afford to do it if you're going to cut revenue that much.
I thank everybody for being so patient. A final sort of more personal question, and I mean, as I sit here listening to you, and it's just been terrific, really underscores what a wonderful, fascinating, personal journey you've had in a relatively short period of time to go from sitting sort of anonymously
my kid was at that time 4. He came back. He said, the teacher, Ms. Wallmeyer's not in class. Well, why isn't she there? She's on a journey. She's on a journey? I'm like, what kind of journey? No, she's on a jury. But all the kids thought she was on a journey. I'm sorry to interrupt you. This journey felt more like jury duty in a way.
I thought maybe if your kids were in CPS, maybe the journey was she was on, 8-year-long probationary period. Impossible to fire her. But so...
I said nothing about it. That was all Jim Warren. I will give you his phone number.
I had 2 CPS kids. It's true. It's true. Really had a remarkable journey. I mean, you've gone in a relatively short period of time from, sitting in a Hyde Park office, sending out emails to somebody about Alan Keyes's reparation plan, to finding herself in White House meetings about some of the most extraordinary economic challenges any president has ever encountered, and parenthetically also showing up on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, which you couldn't have imagined as you were rebutting Alan Keyes. When you step back and think about what you've learned in these last few years, particularly when you were in the hothouse of the White House, undergoing all those problems, and juxtapose it with sort of perhaps your view of government from the more sort of cerebral environs of the Booth School. Tell us a little bit about how your understanding of the way American government works is a little bit different than it might have been a few years ago.
Well, I kind of went thinking, hey, we're going there, I'm ready to race cars, and it turns out it's far more of a demolition derby than it is a car race. I knew I wanted to come back. For me personally, that was it was important that I knew that. A lot of people, a lot of academics even, but a lot of policy people go to Washington, have one eye of, I want to stay here forever, work my way up or do things. As we went there, I didn't want to ever do something that I didn't want to do just to get a promotion or keep a job or something like that. So the first day I got there, I wrote out on the CEA letterhead a resignation letter, and I kept it in my wallet the whole time I was there. And for me, that helped me a lot dealing with the BS of, it's not just the government, I think it's any big organization, but it turns out politics is very political. And that's, there's a frustration that's now more palpable. I kind of intellectually knew there's gridlock, there's everybody's fighting. Then I got there and I'm punching bag, and in the middle of this fighting, and so that part was frustrating but eye-opening. That said, the one thing that was, you work with great people. And I was really impressed with a lot of the people in government. And given the way we as a country treat our people, it's shocking how good the people are. Because it's unbelievable the treatment that they get. But the second is, when you're an academic, you don't realize that both the city of Chicago and the University of Chicago is like paradise. I mean, you got to go away. You come back, it's like, wow, this is really great. The one thing, though, that nags at every academic is you're working on things that are really interesting. You're around super smart people. But on a weekly basis, you're constantly asking yourself, well, does this matter? And who's reading this? And why am I working on this? It's really fascinating, but there's only 50 people who pay attention to what we're doing. You never, ever felt like that in Washington. Okay, so it has a lot of bad aspects about it, but it was like, whoa, today we are deciding, something that's going to affect whether 50 million people will get health care. We're trying to, are we going to rescue the auto industry? Even down to the more prosaic, here's some tax credit. They're going to be 20 million people who buy an alternative energy vehicle if we pass this. If we screw this up, we will have blown. I would come back each day and I'd say to my wife, Robin, who Jim knows, and we're family friends, I'd be like, she'd say, how was work today? Well, I saved the taxpayer $10 billion today. I'd say, I really deserve a bonus, but I'm not going to get one.
Did she then respond, dear, we're out of Charmin, could you go?
Yeah, she'd be like, there's ants, what are you going to do? So that was total focus of purpose. That you never wake up asking, what are we doing here? Is this worth our time to be working on? And, there could be a lot of tough meetings, brutal meetings, that were wrenching, emotionally wrenching. because you don't know. I mean, when we're debating the auto rescue, you know, it's like the entire auto industry may collapse. There may not be an auto industry if we screw this up. And so you'd be in these meetings in the Oval Office, and it's highly charged, and people are kind of mad at each other. And I remember sometimes I'd turn and I'd look, and Obama's got, you're the president. You can get the National Archives to send you whatever you want. I'd turn and I'd look, and there's the original Emancipation Proclamation sign hanging on the wall. And I'd be like, whoa, my God, that's the Emancipation Proclamation. No, you don't, you know, so it was kind of you're back in the argument, but occasionally doing that. And you can get from your congressman tour of the residence, the state dining room and all that stuff. If you have to know somebody who works in the White House to get a tour of the West Wing. And most people will assign the interns in their office the job of giving the tour. I felt a little weird about that. I mean, hey, it's like my mom is coming and I'm going to assign like some intern, go give my mom a tour. But separate from just that I didn't think it was appropriate, I actually came to love giving people the West Wing tour because as just, you know, wrenching as the day was, random person comes in and you could see people be like, oh my God, there's the Oval Office, here's the Roosevelt room. You know, there's the John F. Kennedy's desk where JFK Jr.'s, you know, popping out the thing. There it is right there. And so I gave a lot of tours, and that was one of the highlights for me.
Well, I just want to end by first and foremost thanking everybody here first because you know, this is a weird age and culture in which we're living, in which I think particularly in the media, being provocative and interesting is often given a higher priority than being kind of smart and nuanced and right. So it's really reassuring to see an auditorium packed with you folks. To come and hear somebody as bright and smart and nuanced as Austan, who has also, I think, you know, who belies the notion of, you know, the poor quality of American government as one of those really, really brainy people who gave up a bunch of years to confront some really incredibly difficult things. And I think we should knock on wood and hope whatever happens Tuesday that there are folks just as smart as him who are, you know, giving service to this country in dealing with some of these really difficult problems. So for you first and Austan second, thanks so much.
And then for Jim, thank you, Jim.